just I'm doing the recovery from actually doing, last week doing childcare for my grandson who's 2.5. So you know what they bring home from daycare centers, right? The first year, just everything. I want to open, before I even talk at all, by reading 2 poems. One by an activist woman who really influenced just my desire to write at all. And she recently died. Her name was Adrienne Rich. And she wrote a book called, a number of books. And in one, she ends one of her longer poems with this thing called dedications. And for me, it encompasses everything that I think we do when we write. And so, it's a list. Dedications, Adrienne Rich. I know you're reading this poem late, before leaving your office, of the one intense yellow lamp spot and the darkening window in the lassitude of a building faded to quiet, long after rush hour. I know you are reading this poem standing up in a bookstore far from the ocean on a gray day of early spring, faint flakes driven across the plain's enormous spaces around you. I know you are reading this poem in a room where too much has happened for you to bear, where the bedclothes lie in stagnant coils on the bed, and the open valise speaks of flight, but you cannot leave yet. I know you are reading this poem as the underground train loses momentum, and before running up the stairs toward a new kind of love your life has never allowed. I know you are reading this poem by the light of the television screen where soundless images jerk and slide while you wait for the newscast from the Intifada. I know you are reading this poem in a waiting room, of eyes met and unmeeting, of identity with strangers. I know you are reading this poem by fluorescent light in the boredom and fatigue of the young who are counted out, count themselves out at too early an age. I know you are reading this poem through your failing sight, the thick lens enlarging these letters beyond all meaning, yet you read on because even the alphabet is precious. I know you are reading this poem as you pace beside the stove warming milk, a crying child on your shoulder, a book in your hand, because life is short and you too are thirsty. I know you are reading this poem, which is not your language, guessing at some words while others keep you reading, and I want to know which words they are. I know you are reading this poem listening for something torn between bitterness and hope, and turning back once again to the task you cannot refuse. I know you are reading this poem because there is nothing else left to read, there where you have landed, stripped as you are. And the second poem I want to read is in recognition of what has been going on in Tucson in the last couple months. I think you know, probably all of you know, that not only have they shut down the Mexican American Studies project, not only did they go in with their state workers while kids were in classes to take those books. And to me, this is absolutely critically important to know. Because I got an email from a teacher who was in the classroom at the time. And she said, you can't believe the effect this is having on my kids right now. And also, 2 days ago, they fired the head of the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson. And what has come out about the program is not only the Mexican American kids, but the European American kids, the indigenous kids, all of the kids that take that program, that participate in Mexican American Studies, and it goes from K through 12. Those kids do better on tests, they graduate more people, and get them into college, and yet this program is being shut down. So I want to read from one of the authors that was banned, essentially banned from the schools, from the reading. I was interested to know that they not only pulled from the shelves the Mexican American writers, they pulled indigenous writers. They should pull Sherman Alexie. They pulled Jonathan Kozol. They pulled Paulo Freire. I have a list of books in my folder if you want to see it. One teacher had my book kind of out on her desk to see if they'd pull it. And it's the one called The White Teacher Talks About Race. She said they went by and one kind of indicated, oh, that's good, we'll just leave that there. White people have to have their say. Yeah. I mean, I wish they had read it a little bit. I was kind of insulted they didn't take it. I want to be in the company of all these great writers, Sandra Cisneros. So this is by Martin Espada. And it also gathers together, and I know we do this when we teach writing, but it gathers together this idea of history and literature in one place, in a poem. It's called Sleeping on the Bus, Martin Espada. How we forget Biloxi, Mississippi, a decade before, where no witnesses spoke to cameras, how a brown man in military uniform was pulled from the bus by police when he sneered at the custom of the back seat, how the magistrate proclaimed a week in jail and went to bed with a shot of whiskey, how the brown-skinned soldier could not sleep as he listened for the prowling of his jailers, the muttering and card-playing of the hangmen they might become. His name is not in the index. He did not tell his family for years. How he told me, and still I forget. How we doze upright on buses, how the night overtakes us in the babble of headphones, how the singing and clapping of another generation fade like distant radio as we ride, forehead heavy on the window, how we sleep, how we sleep. I do know that a number of these writers, by the way, took a cavalcade of books about 2 weeks ago into Tucson. They got $20,000 worth of books, those that had been banned, those titles, and they went in groups and are trying to reassemble them in the classrooms. So this isn't over. There's a lot of action around the firing of the man who ran the program too. But to me, the whole story, combined with other stories in the last 2 months, have brought to the fore a kind of anger that's always been in this country and a kind of oppression that's always been here. It seems to be coming out into the open now. I'd like to thank Dwayne Dickens and Britton Gildersleeve for inviting me here today. I've been working with the Writing Project and did some work with Teachers and Writers Collaborative in New York. And it's my favorite thing to do in the whole world is to write with students. And in my books, I describe doing that. I actually took a little break from urban teaching and taught at the Arts High School in Minnesota and actually right in Minneapolis. And the students have written me back. Since I'm 68, I get a lot of students who are writing me back, and soon I'm going to get their kids. You know, it's a little unnerving, but they write me back and say what they remember about being in the creative writing art area. Because while other students went to theater and other students went to music as their art area, we had an art area called creative writing, which is actually very unusual. Usually performing arts places are all about theater, music, and visual art. And they said what they remember the most is the quiet, peaceful moments. We had a big room in the back of the building looking out over a field. Quiet, peaceful moments when they could find their voice. And that was the most, and they said that's what they have taken with them from high school, trying to keep that quiet time for themselves. Then they'll play with it and decide what to do with it, but it was that instant writing time that they liked. I'd like to also mention that I just looked it up, and Toni Morrison did write a novel called Paradise that took place in Oklahoma. I knew I remembered that because I've read every one of her books. I love, my iPad. I'd like to also mention just some recognition for people this last week. The shootings in this city, Trayvon Martin's death in Florida, and what has happened from that death too. That a woman named Brooke Harris, who teaches in Michigan, who was Teacher of the Year twice, was fired because she participated in a fundraising activity for Trayvon Martin's family. Also for a man that's a friend of mine that I know named Robert Simmons, who teaches at Loyola University and is African American, and who all the teachers there, I noticed when I was there in Baltimore this fall, put stuff up in their doors, you know, things they're interested in, you might want to know about. And he put up Trayvon Martin's picture and a little thing about it, and then a picture of his 2-year-old baby boy. That's all. He didn't, and apparently he got a number of complaints about having this. And he said, you know, I don't complain when people put up a picture of Santorum or Kane or Palin or whatever, but he got called what he knew he would be called. He got called an angry black man. You know, so he's fighting it. He's fighting it. He's kept it up. So far, only people are writing some stuff on it, so he has a number of copies of the picture that he puts there. But it's just to see the struggle that he's had at the universities he's been at to try to do what he needs to do. He's a teacher of education. Is to me, it's a feat of incredible survival for him. And what I want to know is why isn't everybody furious about this kind of thing? I keep waiting for this fury from all of us. Why is it relegated to people of color to feel fury? Why aren't we expected to feel that? Maybe we are. I'd like to talk just for a little while about how we begin a process of reconciliation, because I think that's what we need in this country right now. Lives are being lost. Students of color are being expelled and suspended in huge numbers. And there's a recent study that came out, I think it was a month ago, about the high number of suspensions of young black males, and the fact that the suspension rate was much higher for them for the same thing, that whites were not suspended at the same rate for doing the same offense, whatever it was. And that there is this phenomenon of from school to prison pipeline, and that's part of it. That's what we have to recognize, I think. That this is all part of a huge prison industry, actually. And there's an amazing book, if any of you can get this and read this, it's called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And she's a lawyer from California who's written really about this and about the offenses. Then it gets beyond school, where kids are suspended. Then it gets to arrest rates for the same offense. And so the prisons are filled with young black men or Latino men, but in much greater percentage for what they did when whites were not. And what I think you must hear, that I get tired of, is this post-racial stuff. Well, listen, we take care of this. There's no problem anymore because we elected a black president. To me, and I don't know if I'm just being super sensitive as they tell me, I think it's gotten worse in the last 4 years in terms of hostility and anger. And we start, I believe, this reconciliation by listening. And it's so simple. You know, sometimes I really get tired. I've been in education. I do consulting. I'm in schools every week. I talk to kids. I talk to professors. I talk to principals. And to me, we're creating these vocabularies of complexity when and real, simple, honest language is needed. When I talk to people about listening, usually the response is, from very tired teachers, I don't have time. I don't have time to listen. We're doing test prep. We have a little break, and then we're doing test prep. And I do like that title of a book that was published years ago called The Art of Subversive Teaching, The Subversive Teacher. I think that's what we have to become, and I think writing teachers are that, anyway. The things that come out in kids' writing come out, yeah, and you know that, they're amazing stuff. I'm wondering if part of this listening and understanding doesn't also have to do with kids' interest in school and commitment to school and connection to school. I'm thinking about the fact that we lose kids of color in 4th grade. That's when they begin, their attitude begins to say, I don't think this means much to me anymore. At the same time in 4th grade is the switch from learning to read to reading to learn. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that's the grade we're losing some of these kids. I think they're not really seeing what the purpose is in what they're reading a lot of times. Many kids in grades 6 through 12, and it happened last week, so it happens every week when I talk to them about school, say to me, I leave my real self at the door, and I go into that school building. And then when I come out, I get to be my real self again. To me, that says what that image of, it's almost like stripping your real self to go in and then getting to be that person in your body again when you come out. That's where part of this disconnect is. That's where the problem is located. There was a school that I did some work in a couple weeks ago, wonderful school, Minneapolis, where I noticed that the kids, there's literally not a physical boundary between the school and the community. It was a public school. And the kids would tumble into that school, their parents would be there, their parents would be leaving them off, and then somebody from the community would come in, a retired person, and he'd be reading in a corner, and kids would come and go, and there was a feeling that this school was simply part of the community, and that's the way it was going to be. There are not a whole lot of schools like that, and that is my model, actually. I think we start by building bridges to students. Recently, there was a group of teachers from a very exclusive, the one exclusive white school, pretty much white school, about 20% African American kids, but the rest white and college bound in Minneapolis. It's a public school. And they asked me to come in and talk to them because they weren't connecting with their kids, the African American students, and they were worried about this. So I went to meet with them. And before I got there, they were talking about their week. And one teacher said, you know, on Tuesday, when I had them write their autobiography, now this is February, okay? When I had the students write their autobiography, the black kids in my class really came alive. And I said, you can write it in any form you want, and I'm not going to worry about language and stuff for this first round, and we're going to read them aloud if you want, you don't have to, and the whole thing. And she said, that's the first time I saw them engaged. And before anybody else said anything, she said, but you know, then the next day I had to go back to the regular curriculum. And we were reading Romeo and Juliet or something in the 9th grade. And we had to go back to that. And I think that's an example of what's wrong. First of all, it's February when she's done that. And I don't want to put down hardworking teachers, but it's common sense to build some kind of connection and community before February. And maybe it'll take a little longer than a day. You know? I think once we build a curriculum that kids can connect with, And it starts, the best teachers I know, and I've been so lucky to watch great teachers, but the best teachers I know are the teachers that take 2 weeks at the beginning of the year to build community in their classrooms. It's games, a lot of it's writing. And they write throughout the entire year. The entire year. When I taught in middle school, I was telling, when I taught in middle school, it was my last year of teaching, about 10 years ago, and I had this thing where I had the kids come in. First of all, you know middle school, right? I don't have to say anything else, but 6th, 7th, and 8th graders all in one room for 2 hours. We'd have them in 2-hour blocks. And one thing I did was put a music stand up and say, now whenever I stand behind a music stand, you have to stop talking. And then we'll find out what the next thing we're going to do is. And then, but when I did that, I always had at the beginning of each class 10 minutes of quiet writing time. The lights, I try to manage a little bit, anything I could do to make them comfortable. And one day, I thought, we can't do this, but I've got to spend the day, it's a long day, and they're going to take the kids for an assembly and everything. So I got the kids in the room, and it was about, I don't know, January, maybe, December. And so I said, well, let's start right off with the page in the book that we were talking about yesterday. And immediately they got furious. They said, no, well, what about the writing time? What about the writing time, Landsman? And I said, oh, well, I was just going to skip it, you know. No, no, no. And I did collect the writing, and I did respond to the writing, but I don't think that was it. After a while, I don't think that was the most important thing for them. What was important was their voice was there. When I taught in a program for kids kicked out of other schools, I taught a writing class for these. It was in a class actually for teen parents, about 17 years old. And after a while, we added more and more students to that program because the word got out among all the kids in this alternative school that you got to write about your life and talk about your life and read it afterwards and hear other people's stories. And then what we did was direct this into what they might want to use when they apply for college or community college or a job or whatever. They could shape this poem and the subject in it into something entirely different. Not to forget the poem, though. Not to think this is just a vehicle for getting into dominant language stuff. Both of these were important. And the teachers in that school really believed kids had to have choices. So you had to be able to talk about code switching with them. You had to talk about translating. You had to talk about who was going to see this application for that summer internship, which they wanted to get. I think that we can build a classroom and a curriculum where we combine and we use writing in a lesson, in research, in Shakespeare. We can compare and we can contrast. We can use it when we teach percentages, osmosis, the physics of imbalance, uncertainty, and the history of Brazil. I do believe that that's where we can connect with these subjects, with students. We take from the kids' stories and we find the connections to any subject, and we bring our students across to those subjects, and they bring us across to them. We go both ways on that bridge of connection to them. We go out into the communities. We start by getting rid of barriers. The first barrier is curriculum. I don't know if what kind of schools that you were in, but so often there is Black History Month. Or as the kids at Central High School in St. Paul told me this year, Harriet Tubman Month. And I think as you know, I mean, most people are going to say, I'll take it versus nothing, right? I'll take Black History Month if that's all I'm going to get. But what I really want is this interweaving of curriculum. And I want to know that if you've used textbooks and you've probably known what's going on in those lately, there's very little mention of topics that might make people a little bit uncomfortable. So sometimes you'll read a U.S. history textbook and they'll have maybe 4 pages on slavery. And then they'll have 30 pages on battles during the Civil War. And I think it comes from a fear that teachers have, or that textbook writers have. And that's a fear of talking about race. When I was doing a talk for White Teacher Talks about race at a library, about this big an audience, there was a guy doing a video, an African-American young man for a TV station or something. And I was saying, you know, we have to, the kids want to talk about this. In the schools I was in, and have been in even now, the students want to have this discussion. They want to talk about Trayvon Martin. They want to know what's going on, and then they want to talk about why things happen. And the teachers are uncomfortable, and so when I said that the kids want to talk about this, about 3 teachers at different parts of the room stood up and said, yeah, but then there'd be so much anger, and then there'd like, we had problems in the school and behavior stuff. And I said, and I did, before I could say anything, this guy that was taping it dropped the camera down, walked up to the front of the room and said, what are you so afraid of? What are you all so afraid of? And it was a very powerful moment because really that was the sound behind the voice. And I want to say that I don't think it's always there's very little training, real ongoing, day-to-day, year-to-year training in talking about race and culture, in talking about sustaining multicultural pedagogy. In other words, sustaining what our kids come to school with. Not just connecting with it, not just responding to it, but making sure it stays. Making sure no student feels that when they go home, they are going home to an inferior sounding language or environment. The other thing I think that we'll get rid of barriers if we really talk about tracking. If we really talk about tracking. Because I go to schools where principals say, ooh, we've got it together, look at this. You know, we got kids coming in the door together, hanging in the hall by their lockers together. And so I say, well, take me to your advanced placement part of the building. Take me to your gifted section. And they get really uncomfortable. Really uncomfortable. And I go. And what I see are mostly white kids sitting in the advanced placement classes, and I see African American and Latino and Hmong kids in our schools sitting down with the comprehensive program. And so there's got to be a real, true discussion about getting rid of that phenomenon, and why that exists, and why there isn't this connection to keep kids working hard and connecting. I mean, I think there are all sorts of other things going on. In our schools now in Minneapolis, we're providing breakfast, we're providing lunch, we're sending kids home with a backpack with dinner. We're washing clothes for kids. So I know that the conditions that we deal with in schools can be a hodgepodge of things to do. But it isn't that hard to start to change what we're teaching and how we're connecting with all kids. And I believe this is just as important for white kids as it is for kids of color to have this curriculum. Just as important. Not in terms of their identity and their feeling of worth, but in terms of how they will relate to the world as they get older and understand the history of their own country. Getting rid of the physical barrier to parents. One school did a thing in St. Paul where one of those teacher days at the beginning of the year, they sent out teachers to the neighborhood to talk to parents. And at first the teachers were furious. This is taking a whole day, we could do our planning in the classroom. After one day, the next day they came together and said, this is the best thing we've ever done. And they were out there from like 9 in the morning till 8 at night, going talking to parents. And the one question they asked was, what do you want for your kids this year? And they had, what do you want for Jonathan? What do you want for Susie this year? And they learned an incredible amount. Partly their views of these parents was modified. They weren't the uncaring, overly busy, disinterested, unlearned parents that they envisioned. Even if this kid was living with his grandmother, he had library books in the house. When his grandmother cared, and took him to the library once a week. So it also got rid of some of those stereotypes of parenting. Also, getting rid of barriers in the buildings for parents. A lot of parents don't speak English. So there's got to be multiple signs pointing to the office and the bathroom and the cafeteria in their language. We start by understanding that creativity comes with an absence of coercion. There is a terrible, terrible push these days, and we have a new man in our district now who started to militarize education for poor kids. We'll make them highly, highly structured. We'll have them sitting in those rows. We'll have them quiet. We'll have them learning rote instruction so they can take those tests. Well, we will not allow for anything wild, anything unexpected, anything out of our control. We will control these kids. I bet you if some of the more exclusive white schools in this country tried that, the parents would be up in arms. I want my kid to have music. I want to have a rich curriculum. But no, the goal here is to create this working class group that's going to follow orders. And I know that sounds conspiratorial, but I've seen it too often not to believe this. Jonathan Kozol's book, The Failure, The New Apartheid, I think it's called, Failure of American Education, points to this. And kids know it. They watch it. They totally watch what's happening. He's got a scene in that book where one girl says, I don't want to take sewing. I want to take an AP class. And another kid looks back at her and says, they need workers in that sewing factory where your mother works, right? And the little girl says, yeah, about 16-year-old. That's what they want. They want workers for that sewing factory, so just shut up and sew. That's a 16-year-old who feels that way. It means being totally rebellious as teachers. Jonathan Kozol also writes about taking to the streets. And I do think that's starting to happen a little bit around schooling. We start by defying the system and make it clear we're not afraid of our students' brilliance, their activism, and their desire. We start by examining white privilege in a fearless way, by having discussions about this in all grades, including our high school grades. Peggy McIntosh was the person who introduced me to white privilege, really. Her list of white privileges that is still very powerful. When I wrote White Teacher, I actually took a list of 46 of them in her original paper and just started writing from each one, my experience with that privilege. And then knowing our own history and why we are here because of white privilege, why we're where we are often. My father, for instance, grew up in East St. Louis, Illinois, had no money, went into the Air Force, Naval Air Force. When he came out, he had the GI Bill, and he got to buy his first house. And he got to take classes. Often, African-American fighters that came back didn't get those opportunities, especially in places like Levittown that were built for soldiers after the Second World War. They were denied, they were not allowed to buy any houses in those areas. A man I know came back from the Korean War and actually could not get in. The university didn't want to take African-American students in psychology in graduate school. He since went on to get a graduate degree in California and was the first African-American PhD in psychiatry and psychology. His name is Joe White, and he's a remarkable writer. But he carries this story with him. My mother came from some banking money years ago, and I traced where that money came from and how it really originated in Southern money, sending up cotton to textile factories. for a while. Let's do that. Because actually my life as a white woman is different than my friend Mary Moore Easter's life as a black woman. There are differences. I go to Northfield to fill in at Carleton College once in a while as a teacher. Haven't been there for years. And I go into a store and I don't get asked for ID. Mary Moore Easter, who's been a professor at Carleton for years, still was when I was teaching there too, would go into a store and still get asked for ID. Our lives are different. We could talk about, I mean, I think we could spend a whole morning talking about gender, and we could talk about class and where they intersect. But I do think there has to be a moment where we rest in talking about race. We start by willing to look at the history of the country we live in, built as it was on the destruction of indigenous people, the kidnap and enslavement of generations of black Africans, the gross mistreatment of Chinese, Japanese. And knowing this history, we start by telling the truth to ourselves and to our students, encouraging them to study all that makes up their past and their neighborhood or small town. And I was at a class recently where I talked about some of this, and a young man, a Latino man, raised his hand and he said, "But isn't it all about history? Isn't that what we need to talk about?" And he was right, it was. And it was, you know, it's that you read all the time, there's new history all the time. There isn't a set thing we put in a textbook that's actually coordinated by a group in Texas who decides, luckily that's changing, but a group in Texas who decides what's going to be in the textbook or not. The state legislature, because Texas buys a lot of textbooks. And so we get a certain view of history. It's digging, the best history teachers are finding all this new material that has been found in vaults. Henry Louis Gates found the slave narrative book that he published about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe 10, that was just discovered. So history is actually so vibrant and so present. And you'll find a new book on Ben Franklin, and you'll find out he was kind of a jerk at times, right? And so it does come down to history, but it comes down to also to our students' reaction to history. And how do we encourage that critical thinking in them? And when they write, how do we encourage them to look at all sides of a situation and then to write that opinion piece? When I taught composition at the U, one of the assignments students had to do was to go to, they had to pick an issue. Let's say it's, oh, here's one. This is what happened too. The student came up to me and said, I want to write, and this was 10 years ago, I want to write on women working in the home or going out to work. Now the assignment was to interview someone on the opposite side that you are, right? And then to write your opinion piece. But first you interview somebody on the other side. So dumb me says, oh, so you want to probably go interview somebody who believes women should stay in the home, right? And he said, no, that's my position. And I said, well, then interview me, if you want. His position was that women should not be allowed to work outside the home. That just should not happen. It's bizarre, you know? But he did go and interview somebody else. I didn't have him interview me. I think that wasn't appropriate, probably. But it was but that's a great assignment for kids. That's a wonderful assignment to have kids do. Have them interview somebody on the other side of an issue, and then come back and then try to formulate something clear in the writing. We go on, and I wanted to read this list of just a few verbs here because people tell me I have done this at different times in their lives, students. We go on to advocate, coach, model, push, nudge, badger, call home, nag, meet after school, start breakfast clubs, homework help sessions, support groups, in order to bring about equity, not just equality. Equity. There's got to be a lot of work in catching up and finding, as Robinson, I can't remember now his first name, who wrote the book The Debt, this incredible book about what we owe. And Gloria teachers of African American children, writes, instead of the achievement gap, she writes the education debt that we owe to our students, or the opportunity gap that is here. It's not an achievement gap. That's putting an awful lot on students when it's the system that's actually failed them. We go on to make children's voices and their interests the center of our classroom. Their voices, and that means having them read aloud when they want to too. There's something about that coming from your body sound of your own words. And I know you've had the experience where kids start to read a piece and then they break down. I had a young girl, I think it was 4th grade the other day, was reading about her mom in prison. And she was all set. She got up there on the stage and started reading, and then she just dissolved. And then we waited and she finished her piece. So there has to be a faith and a belief in the process and the importance of those words coming from that body. Lisa Delpit has a great example in her book, The Skin We Speak, about her daughter who hated school, coming home in 7th grade. And Lisa's African American, and she said, I thought it was always race, and the kid was getting, had problems, and we'd talk about it, and the young woman said, yeah, but I just don't like school, it's so boring. And so one day in 7th grade, she comes home and she said, I love school. And it was like 2nd week in September. And Lisa said she tried to be casual, 7th grader, you don't want to zero in too hard. So she said, oh, that's nice, that's great. What are they doing there? And she said, we're going to spend the whole year talking about hair. And Lisa said, what do you mean the whole year talking about hair? I mean, she was a little worried about, covering curriculum herself, And the young woman, they said they did a survey, and I really suggest surveys on kids' interests. Whatever way you do them. I know a science teacher does how many things in your home use, science and physics and electric, whatever you can do to get at a kid's situation. The initial surveys are always a good thing to do in those first 2 weeks. And one of the things all the kids in school were interested in was hair. 7th and 8th grade. Well, of course, that makes sense. Look at the hairstyles. Look at what's changing. So, what they had done was devise a way that every week, one subject area would some way cover hair. They'll do it in science. That's not hard. That's genetics. That's all sorts of complicated subjects. Do it in literature. That's not hard. History. Great hairstyles. Math, you could do. Lisa said, her daughter said, see, when I pull my hair down, it's this long. And then when I let it go, it's that long because it's curly. We have to find the percentage pull and short. Teachers can be ingenious. And so once a week, they would be doing this. And kids could add to that set of things to learn about hair. It's giving trust to kids in their interest. There's schools that have run a whole year on fixing up a library so it can contain heat and energy more. And they've devised ways to do that. It's amazing. I remember one year as kids, I had a book I found called Snaps. And it was things that you say to put down from playing the dozens in a lot of African-American communities that I was in. And it was a book called Snaps. And a friend of mine grabbed it. There was a teacher there, and she stood outside in the hallway. And she was saying all these things as the kids went by. Your mother is so dumb. And the kids would stop. This was at the alternative school for kids in serious trouble. And they would stop and go, whoa, Carlson, what are you doing? And she said, well, here's this book. So they grabbed the book. And then she said, explain to me what this word means. I don't know this word. And what's this term you're using? And they did. So that what we did, what we had in my room then as the English teacher, was a glossary that the kids added to every day or whenever they wanted to. And it was called Terms White People Don't Know. and so we created this book. And by the end of the year, of course, it was like a thick tome. And it didn't take all hour. It didn't take away from college essays or whatever. I mean, there are ways to make that crossing over, not having to give up your entire life, your secret life. we start and we go on because we know that the process of writing, the centering of the self in those quiet moments, is the gift we and our students take with us. And I never discount the fact that those quiet moments were what kept me in school too, kept me teaching. There was something beautiful about looking over that classroom. And even the rowdiest kids, once it got to be, and I've done a lot of work on behavior management stuff, once it got to be a kind of ritual for them, because a lot of the kids I worked with, especially in the alternative school, lived in chaos. They lived in chaos. And so they wanted some kind of, and it wasn't chaos because their parents, by the way, were into crime or their moms were in prison. It was because economics were so bad they were having to work 2 shifts. And so it was hard to know where the meal, who was going to do it, what sister was in charge of what little brother, and picking up. And what they wanted in my classroom, after a while, they wanted safety. And they wanted a place that was somewhat predictable. I didn't tell them every activity we would be doing, but I did start in that quiet way each day. And that did seem to make a difference. And I remember once when I was writing with the students and they were reading, and it was about fathers. It was a very powerful moment. And one of the kids looked up and said, you know, it's kind of like church in here sometimes. And it was kind of like church. And I will tell you one thing that happened to me once when I went in as a writer in the schools, to the same school I taught at 2 years after. And I got there, and it was about November, and I had the kids, and it was about their 3rd session, so they were getting out their notebooks. A new student came in, which is what we got in that school all the time. And she came in, and she sat down, and she didn't look happy, and she said, what are we doing? And the teacher said, well, this is Julie's here to visit, and we're going to do writing with her. Oh. And so I talked a little bit, and I said, okay, write about I want. I took a real simple phrase, I want, just start with that. And I explained a little bit more about it. This young woman, and we went around the room after and we were reading, and she said, I want some white teacher who has no idea who I am to stop asking me to write about what I want. I want these white teachers who have no clue about my life to stop thinking they don't, and she just ran, went on this rant. And I had this faith in the process. Now I have a friend who says I wouldn't have done what you did, Julie. But I said, no, okay, thank you. And we went on to the next person. Meanwhile, all the kids are going, what's she going to do? What's she going to do? We went on to the next person. That was the ritual. We had already established that. And she looked around like, didn't get the attention, but got to say her say. Got to say her say, because that was a legitimate say she had. So we kept going, and the next round we did was about sisters or uncles, or it was about a family. They said, let's write about family. And it might have been uncles. And she just joined right in. And by the end of the hour, we did 3 rounds, and she came up afterwards and talked. And we never talked about that first piece of writing. We never did. It got absorbed, and we went on. And so there is a way of having, I think, the faith in this writing process that is so important. So important that the kids know their voice is there. I never let them put down each other in writing. That is a rule I have, and it's one of the few. Nobody gets hurt in here. But especially a new student, I want them to know this is really what I'm saying. You can write when you want to write for these 10 minutes. There is a recent wonderful New York Times science article called Your Brain on Fiction. And it is about empathy. And they can actually wire people up while they're reading novels. I love this because I love novels. They can wire people up, and people's brains light up in the empathy region when they're reading a novel. So I think this is very exciting news for all of us who are interested in literature. And it also makes me a little concerned if we are going to focus all of our writing, and there's talk about reading and writing being much more focused on nonfiction now. That's been the word that's come down. And I'm concerned about that. I'm very concerned about that. Because I like the idea, of course, that lights up in the empathy section when we read fiction. I think finally, and I'm going to read just a poem I wrote, but I think the fact that the majority of teachers in this country, 84% now, are white. It's always up there high. Sometimes even gets higher over the years. Is essential for understanding why this connection with school sometimes seems so broken. And it's not the kids don't individually like us as teachers, but when they walk in, there's this visual effect of seeing in front of them white bodies in so many of their classrooms. It's kind of like, I'll draw an analogy here, the effect of seeing a couple weeks ago or a month ago when they were having a panel before Congress on contraception for women. And on that panel, there were only older white men. One woman talking about contraception for women in front of this hearing. And you know, there's something really alienating about that. And not only kind of almost humorously, but very viscerally for me. And maybe it's my age, you know, maybe it's being 68 and I thought we had kind of worked out some of these things. Even my mother, who was a right-winger, my mother worked for Planned Parenthood. I mean, this is going way back. This felt for a while here in this, it felt medieval to me, actually. So I think we have to think about how we people our buildings, who we hire, and who we bring in as visitors and poets and musicians and community members, and how do we do this that takes away from that visual impact on a young student. And then I'd like to read this poem I wrote right after Katrina. Katrina for me was one of the most devastating things in my lifetime. I did march in Selma, Montgomery March, and I did work in civil rights for years. But I felt some hope. And I think my son at 42 says one of the things we don't have really in some of the work we're doing is as much hope as you guys had. And I think that probably is true. I think there's some feeling of being helpless, or we can't buck this huge corporate craziness. Katrina kind of brought me back. So it's just called Shall We? Shall we mourn by the river? Shall we join the soul patrol and hurry on down, glide over houses and bodies of old men who used to work at the docks, long days and slow mornings of arthritic rising? Might we not march as a nation with this new diaspora, following along the banks of the Mississippi from the headquarters to Baton Rouge to the Gulf to Pontchartrain to Biloxi? Let us do this American funeral upright, with trumpets and lines of live bodies, songs about loved ones left behind, their mornings on hot porches, their evenings with cigarettes and wine. Shall we weep along the river? Can we move in rhythm to a single voice? A Miriam or an Aretha, a Shirley or an Etta, some ghost from Bourbon Street. Let millions of us dance in a line snaking from sea to shining sea, as schools release the children who put their hands in ours and we moan a low note of pleading, keening, searching for some old-time get-happy sound. Shall we gather together to start this whole country all over? Let us begin with compassion this time around and with great respect for the native in his home. Let us have a true American funeral, singing our way to forgiveness. Let us search for Preservation Hall, listen for funk, gospel, soul, blues, and jazz, in order that all of us, even the most reluctant, can finally arrive in New Orleans, there to tend to the new Atlantis that is now a city of graves, of the abandoned children, lost men, fragile old women caught stumbling below the levees. Let us mourn along the river in America, join that soul patrol, sing songs the way all who are no longer there, on front stoops, in upstairs windows, on bar stools, fierce love, our desire for saxophone, 2 a.m., our need for redemption. It is who we are now, finally, a people who have come to ask for mercy. Thank you. Questions, just on anything, writing or teaching or kids, classrooms? Yeah.
Can you address Generation 1.5 a little bit?
Generation 1.5?
The children of immigrants who graduate from American high schools and then come to Tulsa Community College, let's say, and they have ESL issues still that their comp teacher won't like.
Right, right. We had this happen, and we still are in Minneapolis. We have a lot of students from Somalia. We're one of the largest centers, and still coming. Families, and the mom from Cambodia and Laos are in our community too, and the Karen people. And I do have friends teaching at community colleges, and what they're finding is they're setting, what they've finally done in the university even is to set up whole centers for specifically, you know how they have